Yeah, okay. So here we got a really good question here from Juan, and it looks like he's got a new fancy profile picture, which is very cool. And so the question for those who maybe aren't looking at Discord is there any recommended library to connect to DB, I think database? Quill seems the most used one, but any recommendations? Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And let me maybe share my screen here just so we can do a little bit of note taking on this. And then I think this is also one where some of the other folks here may have some experience with this. So I think this is also maybe a good one for people to jump in on. Okay, I'll make this a little bit bigger. And I'm not sure we're going to necessarily need a ton of code for this one, but sometimes I just talk as I type, and it'll give us something here. So the question was basically, if I can restate it a little bit, what are the options for database libraries in ZIO ecosystem? And there are basically three options. So one of them is ZIO Quill. One of them is ZIO SQL. And the third one is ZIO JDBC. And so I think a lot of times people maybe see one or two, or maybe all three of them. And I mean, one is the question is kind of, okay, what's the set of things that are out there? But two is kind of what are the pros and cons of each of them, and when would I use each of them? And I'll give my take, and then I definitely encourage people after this. Maybe I'll go back to Discord and share your own experiences, and I'll try to kind of, I guess, give a knowledgeable but unbiased take on these three. So ZIO Quill is the first thing is I think it is the most mature of these. So ZIO Quill came from Quill, which is a library that's been around in the ZIO ecosystem for a long time, actually before Scala 3 existed, before ZIO existed. So it's been around for quite a while. Originally, it was developed by Flavio, and then Alexander Ioffe, who's one of my colleagues at Zyverge, kind of took over maintaining it. So I think the first kind of, I guess, pro of that is it's very battle tested. So I think if I just kind of at least in finance, there's this joke that like no one ever got fired for investing in IBM stock, which is probably kind of funny now because, like, I mean, I guess IBM's done better with Satya, but for a while is not really the hippest company. But I think if you want kind of the option that like you're not gonna get in trouble for having picked, I think Quill is probably good in that respect. The other thing that you really get with Quill is you get this quoted DSL. And so what that means is that you write your query as basically just like a string of SQL text, but you get a compile time validation for it. So write SQL text and get compile time validation. And I think a lot of people like that because obviously you kind of like that you have some compile time validation for it, but also like SQL's own language, and you want to write SQL, you just write SQL. And it's got just a lot of kind of features built on top of it. So I think that's definitely kind of a good option there. ZIO SQL, definitely less mature, right? They don't have a 1.0 release yet. I was actually just talking to another one of my colleagues, Yaro, who's contributed a lot to this library, and we're talking about kind of some of the things he wants to get in for it for its next release. So I think one of the things he's working on there is doesn't have Scala 3 support yet, which depending on what you're doing, it may either be a deal breaker or it may not be an issue at all. But the idea with this is it has its own domain-specific language for SQL queries. And so instead of just writing, select star from X, whatever, you would do something like table dot select, and then whatever you want to select. And basically, you would have Scala functions that construct and build up all of your queries, and you have a very under the hood, this library is a lot of very specific, very advanced, actually type level programming to kind of make sure that it can build those queries in a way that makes sense, even though maybe what you're putting in is just strings. So both of these are kind of different takes, right, of the kind of quoted macro powered versus the domain specific type level programming on ways to build your queries. And then ZIO JDBC is, I would say, the lowest level of these three. And so you have interpolation for SQL queries, but not as many things built on top, I would say, and focuses kind of just let me get something or write something to a database. And I think in the future, probably where we're going is that these two libraries will actually use ZIO JDBC under the hood for kind of the underlying access to the database, and then they'll provide these higher level APIs on top of that. Right now, each of these libraries is kind of doing their own thing to manage like the transaction and everything that goes into that. But I think it probably makes sense to consolidate that. So I think right now, again, it depends a little bit on like what you're doing and what your preferences are. I think ZIO SQL is a great option in terms of just, again, it's been around a long time, very kind of used widely that way. I think ZIO JDBC is nice just because it kind of is in a way like trying to do less. And so it just kind of does what it needs to do and doesn't need a whole lot else on top of it. So I would say this is the one that I probably personally tend to use a bit more, but I mean, I'm not to say anything against any of the other ones. And then this one I think will eventually be really cool. I think depending on what you're doing might be a little bit early for what you're doing, though, if you really kind of like having that Scala DSL, then all these libraries, right, there are early adopters for all of them. But those are kind of the options that I would think about out there, and at least kind of my take on the pros and cons between them. Maybe I'll go back to the Discord now and just see if anyone else has shared any thoughts between those three. Previous profile photo was 10 years ago. Nice. Yeah, so Scott, you had kind of the tech version versus the finance version of the old joke. But yeah, sometimes these go in different directions. And then there's a question about NoSQL databases. So I think there are some more specific solutions out there. So like there's a ZIO DynamoDB, there are kind of solutions for like specific providers. And you can use like, especially Quill, you can use for like working with Cassandra or stuff like that. So there's some more specific ones out there. I'd say these are kind of most general purpose type ones. Also, depending on what you're doing, there's a ZIO Redis library if you want to use Redis. So there's some that are like a little bit more specific. Interesting. Is it Oolong? That's a fun name. I haven't heard of that one, but that sounds cool. Okay. Well, I hope that answered that question. Let me see how Juan is typing. So let's see if he has a follow-up that addresses things. And then hopefully everyone else, while I've been talking here, has been thinking of other things that they want to cover. Okay, who is next? I see Adrian's typing. All right. Okay, yeah, this is good. You're like hitting on the greatest hits. So, and I guess some of these we'll see how much coding we get to do. This may be a more coding symposium or more just a talking symposium. But so Adrian asks, what's the state of ZIO HTTP right now? And I think we very much want to get out a 1.0 version. The approach I always have to kind of 1.0 versions is they don't necessarily need to have every feature there, but that they should have kind of the features that you would need in normal usage. And they should, at least at that time, kind of work for that and not have any bugs or issues. And so what I like to have, and kind of what we had going back to like when we did the first 1.0 release of ZIO, is we do release candidates, and we basically kind of do release candidates that hopefully have a smaller and smaller scale until we get to a point where it's been X, let's say 4 weeks, where like everyone's had the last release candidate out in the wild and they haven't reported any issues with it, or at least they haven't reported any, call it, material issues with it. So we're in that process now. I think we are actually probably overdue to get another release candidate out. We've got a couple of issues that we're working through, particularly around streaming. So we want to, when we kind of ask people to kick the tires on the next release candidate, we want to at least feel like, to the best of our knowledge, it kind of does the things that they're going to need it to do, and that they're not just going to immediately kind of come back and be like, well, this thing doesn't work. We already know it doesn't work. So we're in the process of working through that. I think there's been a lot of great contributor activity. I don't know if Nabil is here for this Zymposium, but he's been doing a lot of great stuff and stepping up on that. Daniel obviously has always done a ton. I've been doing more recently. I mean, John did a huge amount around like the endpoints API and routes. So I'd really like to kind of get to a point where we feel good about getting another release candidate out there and do that soon. And then my target would be to have a 1.0 version by functional Scala, so basically beginning of December. That is obviously a little bit subject to what I said before. That means we need to kind of get a release candidate out before that we feel good about and that people have a chance to play with. So, maybe that ends up not being kind of 1.0, but release candidate X that hopefully we feel very good about. And we can say, well, look, release candidate X is out. And as long as there's no issues identified with it in the next couple of weeks, then 1.0 will be released. But that's high level where I'm thinking about that. And hey, Nabil, yay. Yeah, any does that answer your question, Adrian, about ZIO HTTP? Awesome. Okay. Yeah, definitely. Okay. How about other questions from folks? And they can be these kinds of like textual talking questions, or it can be like, hey, how would I do a certain thing, or just I'd be interested in hearing more about a certain topic. All of those are great. Nabil's typing. So Nabil says that he has only one more thing to solve for the open API generation. Hopefully get emerged next week. That would be awesome. So Yeah, would love to get that merged, and then maybe whenever you feel ready, we can have Nabil on, and he can give a talk about his work on that, because I think it's I've been kind of following indirectly, but it's a nice example of some of the benefits of introspectability, as well as kind of the work you need to do to make sure that things stay introspectable. Because I know I was making one change to the endpoint kind of definitions, the way they work, and I was kind of judicious to do it in a way that it would still be analyzable for things. And I know he was giving feedback on at least one other thing of like, hey, if you go this way, we'll not make it analyzable. So I think it'll be a cool applied example of that. There's one other question on what's the state of ZIO Chat GPT. So it's out there. You can do it through the ZIO website, and I think you can, or very shortly will be able to do it through Discord. I don't know if anyone's played with that recently. And basically, we worked very hard to basically prompt it to give information about ZIO2 and to provide it with information about ZIO2, so it gives you ZIO2 appropriate stuff. It is one of those things where, just like ChatGPT, it kind of takes information from the internet in addition to a specific corpus of documents we feed it. So it's not always right there, but I know there was an issue in the past with it kind of getting confused between ZIO1 and ZIO2. We've really tried to focus it entirely on ZIO2. So hopefully that's better, but definitely continue to give us feedback on that, and we'll keep working on that. Okay, so we got another question, Adrian. He says he has a need in what a project is on to make layer loading more dynamic. His examples is provide a JSON with some features, and based on some map of features and layers, create the app. Sure, so we can, yeah, so let's see if we can kind of sketch this out. So I think if I'm kind of capturing what he's saying, he's got something like, we've got like feature A, feature B, and feature C, and then these each map to services. So this maps to like service X, service Y, and service Z, and then this maps to some other, I use different letters here, service, I don't know, S, and service T, and then this maps to service W, I guess. Is that kind of the idea there, Adrian? So I think the first thing that strikes me about this is, so basically it sounds like let's say we have final class features. We don't say seal trait feature. All right, so we've got these three features, and then maybe features is like a map, or maybe it's really more like a set of features. And so we have, let's say, object features. And then we have some layer, probably doesn't input anything, but outputs one of these features. And then we eventually want to have, say, val my app. And then I'll just make that question mark. This will be, I guess this will be, initially I'm just going to call this ZIO unit. And so it sounds like what we want to basically do here is we want to have like my app, and then we want to provide it with both this features.layer that's going to have some combination of these features. And then we also want to provide it with something else that basically is going to, depending on which of these features exists in here, actually create some of these services. And maybe let me just initially just create like a service. I won't create them all because we have a bunch of them, but service X, create service Y, create service Z, and so on. So I think the first, I guess, question I have, Adrian, or observation is, it sounds like this needs to work with whatever features I apply or I supply here. So like, I'll just have some examples. So I could say about empty. So it seems like, I mean, if we could not provide any features at all, then that implies we could also not construct any of these services up here, which means this application has to be able to run without any of these services. So in other words, in my app, I can't call service X dot do something or service Y dot do something because I don't know that service X is going to exist or that service Y is going to exist. So at least kind of looking at this from the perspective of types, what it seems like that would indicate is that like services X and services Y and services Z essentially don't get to do anything but say start a background process, which still could be significant, but kind of limits how they can be used. But I want to, I guess we're doing a little bit of interactive problem solving here, Adrian. So tell me if that's making sense or if there's something different that you're thinking about here. Okay, so then we're kind of saying that each of these services, I think if I'm understanding you right, is just going to basically start a background, some kind of background process. Let's just. Or the other way we could, I think, conceptualize this is we could say that each of these has to be just a different implementation of the same thing. But it sounds like we're kind of going down the road of saying that each service just applies some background process. And so then I think what you might want to do is, I mean, if they really do nothing but start something that they don't need to have any similarities, but maybe if these are all, like it sounds like these are all actually either GraphQL transformers or HTTP middlewares. So I think then we're saying that all these services actually have some similarity to them. So I don't know, let's just initially say we make up something like, we call this a GraphQL transformer here. And each of these things then And maybe then we also have something like, maybe we have something like final case class composite. First, second extends GraphQL transformer. Right, so we say we can have, and maybe these are actually become like, let's call them maybe primitive or single. So we could say something like single extends transformer. We would just put these in an object to organize them a little more. So I think if we do this, then it becomes more clear how this is going to work, where we're going to have this features thing that's going to produce a set of features. And then we're going to have another, maybe we put it down here. We could say val layer here. And this could be a Z layer that, given a set of features, is going to return the GraphQL transformer that we're going to use for those features. And then here, I think we can kind of basically bake in our logic here of how we're going to create each of these, because then in here, we can look at the features, we can see what feature exists, and based on that, we can construct the services that we want to include here, and then we can combine them together if we can imagine. I mean, this could have like a plus method, so that we can basically, we'll look at the features, we'll determine the ones we want, and then we'll just combine them all. And I mean, this, at least right now, this kind of assumes maybe plus plus isn't quite the right, maybe there should be like and, because it seems like maybe there's not sequentiality that's being represented here. I think one of the things we'd want to think about in our modeling is like, does this represent sequentiality of like, there's a definite order of applying these transformations, or is it just each of these will be applied and there is no guaranteed order and they need to be value preserving that way? But I think that's maybe how we, how I would approach that. Does that make sense, Adrian? Okay, cool. Yeah, fun little mini domain there. All right. Who else has stuff they would like to cover? Scott, I think I saw you. I know you're here. Let's see, who else have we got? Yeah. Raheem, let's check. Pavel. Can be a question, or it can also just be a topic of like, hey, I'd be interested in seeing more about this. All right, well, why don't, so I know one question I've gotten in the past has been about like actors and implementing actors with ZIO. And we did some coverage of that like a while back, but I mean, at this point we've been going with Zymposium for a while now. So I think just because we've covered something in the past doesn't mean we shouldn't cover it again. So I think I'll spend a little bit of time on that, but definitely as I'm going through, if anyone just has a thought on kind of something else they'd be interested in, we can put that on the back burner at any time. But so I think what I'm going to do here is maybe I'll just call this. Maybe I'll just create another file here. Okay. Okay, so I think actors are something that a lot of people have had questions about because I think one, just they've maybe been coming from Alka, and that's obviously but really the abstraction there that you use, as well as I think they can just be natural ways of thinking about certain problems, and in particular, they very naturally scale up to thinking about um, each actor as like you could think of as like a node in a distributed system. And so I think one of the nice things about the actor paradigm is it has that natural transition from the kind of local case to the remote case that I think with other paradigms can require a little bit more thinking about. And one of the cool things about ZIO is we can actually create our own actors, and we can do it in a pretty simple way. So if we start to build this out and kind of expand this and to our leisure, but if we think about like what the actor trait is, I think it's kind of defining thing is it basically has you can send it some message, and at least kind of the I think where they've gone with actors in general is that like this is the kind of exclusive way of interacting with them. I think some have something like basically this pattern that gives you back some response, but that kind of has I think, grown to be disfavored just because that means you kind of suspend until you get the response back, and you want everything to be completely asynchronous. So I think we'll start with this. And so this actually compiles. We'll give this some kind of message type, or maybe I'll call this in. So in the kind of, I think, most traditional world, an actor is something that you can send messages of some type. You can define what they are, and then it's going to do some completely unknown side effect in the world, which is both kind of the flexibility and maybe the challenge. So to ZIOify this a little bit, first I'm just going to make this contravariant because I can, and I want to use declaration site variance wherever possible. So this is an input. So I'll just mark that as contravariant there. And then I'm going to change this to ZIO any nothing unit. Oh, Adrian's got another question. Let's see. So Adrian says, I have another question. The fiber model and life cycle. What do children inherit? What happens on exceptions with them? Are there any differences when they fail or die? How will you? Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean, this we can definitely come back to. So let me go there, and maybe I'll create another new file here. Maybe I'll call this fibers.scala. Okay, so let's just kind of capture those little questions for us here. So what do children inherit? And then what happens on exceptions with them? Differences between failure and death. Yeah, so that's a great question. So to answer the first question of what do children inherit? basically I think the simplest way to think about it, and we'll get a little more specific, but children inherit all fiber ref values based on the can't spell definition of fork in the fiber ref. And generally, this is just giving the child a copy of the parent's value. And to be a little more specific there, the environment is a fiber ref. A lot of things are fiber ref that you may not realize, which implies that the children get the environment of their parents and the services that the parent is using. And you can kind of see that for yourself. Do this here. So let's say I have the child is going to be something that uses a string in the environment just to kind of play with something, and is just going to do, say, ZIO, what services ZIO string, and then is basically just going to print out that it got this thing. And then we're going to have a parent that is going to do something very boring, but will just be kind of for illustrative purposes. And what it's going to do is it's going to fork the child, and then it's going to join the child again. So this is basically not going to do a whole lot for us, just to kind of illustrate this point. And now my actual method here is I'm just going to run the parent, and let's try compiling this. Let's see what error we get. Well, okay, so first let me make sure. Okay, so what do I do here? So I define features twice. Okay, this is feature. Okay, let me just move. Let me just get rid of this. And features. So what happens when I don't actually compile my code? Okay, there we go. So we try to run this program, and you notice we're getting an error that let's see, okay, no, IntelliJ doesn't, or VS Code does not want to help me out here. I should not malign IntelliJ for VS Code's sins. But we can see if we look at the signature parent that it requires a string in the environment. I haven't provided one yet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to provide one. And I'll just do ZLang.succeed. Hello world. And now I'm going to run this program. And well, outside of this thing, which is just a warning about my other thing. So I'm going to run this, and we run the fibers. And you see the child got hello world. And if you probably don't think about this that much because it just works. But for this to work at all, the child has to get a copy of the environment that the parent has, because the child here is accessing this string, but we never provided the child. We provided the parent. So whenever you provide the environment to the parent, then it has to go down to the children. And that is one of those things that, like, if you think about it, it makes sense, but most of the time you don't think about it because it just works, because your program may use different services and different fork fibers, and obviously you got to be able to use that, and that has to have access to the same services. So the environment is one of these fiber refs. So this is inherited. And then the other thing is regional settings such as interruptibility. And this is actually, well, this is a fiber ref too. Are also fiber refs and are also inherited. And I think the intuition you should have for all of this is really, so this thing here, we can simplify this even more. We could say that this is basically child dot for flat map join. So this is fork a fiber to do something and join it immediately. And let me compare that to just child. Do the thing immediately. These two things should be the same to the maximum extent possible. Obviously, in the underlying implementation, there's some difference of here we're actually creating another fiber and then we're waiting for it versus here we're not. But from a user perspective, this should be a safe refactoring to do as much as it possibly can be. Because, I mean, here, this example is a little bit silly, but we could imagine we have something where, let's say hello bunch. So let's say we have some names, and this is a list of string. And we want to do ZIO dot for each. I can do for each discard if I want. Names, and I can take that name. So this is something I might do, right? I mean, here it's a little bit silly if I'm just printing names, but you could imagine all the time. This is take all these entities and write into the database, or all sorts of more real world things. And we might do this, but we might at some point refactor this. And we say, well, why don't I just write them in parallel? And those two, again, as long as you're not relying on these internally relying on the ordering between them, they need to be written in the database in a certain order, these should be the same as far as possible in the ZIO implementation. And basically the difference between those two comes down to this difference here of, is just doing a thing different than forking a fiber to do the thing and immediately joining it. And to the maximum extent possible, it should not be different, which is kind of why we have these semantics around what fibers inherit and what actually get back when you join them. But that's kind of the high level idea there to give you an intuition for that. So let me hit on a couple of the other questions. So Juan says, what can I do if I don't want the child to inherit the environment? Well, you can provide it with a new environment. So if I want to not give it, so let's say this was, I provided it hello world. So what if I don't want that? I could instead, I'm going to comment this out. So this is just well formed again. And I could do child dot provide zlayer dot succeed hello child. Let's try this. Let's see. Oops, what here. See. Oh, there's this stuff, obviously. That was very silly of me. And this that was ZIO exception. So I'll just go by this. And now the child got hello child. So we can always override the environment with a more specific when we want to, but just from the perspective of the types here and making sure that things are well typed and you essentially never are able to access something in the environment that's not actually there, we have to give you the parents by default, and then you can override it if you want to. So that's the answer on that. So we talked about what they inherit. I think the other thing that Adrian was asking was, are there any differences between when they fail or die? And there's not really, other than just what error handling operators you use for them. So let me show you a couple of things here. So the first thing to notice is, let me say I just forked this thing here. And let's say that this thing, instead of doing this thing, let's say this thing just fails. So this program, even though this child fiber failed, this overall program is not going to fail because we never joined this fiber. So let's try running this program. And we see it just completes normally. So if I fork a fiber and I never join it, its failure is not my failure, right? It's kind of, I don't know, if I'm like, the big corporate boss, right? And I have someone do something and they mess up, like I'm kind of saying like, it's not on me. Like they just messed up, but it's not on me. So that's what happens if I just fork it. Now, if I join it, I make its failure my failure. So now let's run this. And now we see child failed, and now parent failed as well because they joined the child. And this is going to be the same thing if I do die. So let me change this to say die message, die. So if I join it, I'm going to get that failure, just with a slightly different error message because it's a die failure. And if I don't join it, I just fork it, then again, its failure is not my failure. Now, these failures by these child fibers, these are sometimes what we call unhandled fiber failures, right? Because this fiber did fail, and there's no error handler added in the middle here or at the end here, but this wasn't ever joined back to the main application. And so these are by default logged at the debug level. Some people like to increase the log level for them. I generally recommend against that. The issue is essentially you can have kind of two different types of situations. So one type of situation is where you really don't expect this thing to fail and you want to know if it did. But the other is a lot of times you may have situations where it's actually somewhat expected that some fibers are going to fail, where you say like, hey, let me run these three fibers that are all trying to do something and give me back the first one to succeed. And the fact that the other ones failed is not really a problem from your perspective. Maybe that's kind of why you use that operator. You said like, hey, I'm going to like try these three data centers and I'm trying three of them because I know like one of them may fail, but as long as one of them gets me back what I need, then I'm happy. And so what I would usually, so again, you can play with that log level if you want to. There's a runtime setting, I think it's called default unhandled error log level. Let me just see if I can show you that for a second. Runtime. Let me just click through the runtime. Oops. Yep. Set unhandled error log level. So if you really want those failures to be logged, even though you didn't join them, you can do this set unhandled error log level, and you can set it to something that's not debugged, so it gets logged normally, or just depending on the default logger doesn't log debug messages. But if you're logging at a more fine-grained level, then you can play with that. So that's kind of one solution. But what I'd usually recommend is, like in this case, if this is something where I want to know if it failed, then I can just I can just do something with that error. So like, I think there's an operator. Let's see if I got the name of this right. This is called ignore logs. And let me just make sure that I just keep the program from exiting immediately. So I'll just like sleep for 1 second here, just so this has a chance to do its thing. And then I can do this. And oh, I think this only does wait a second. I'll have to go back and take a look at what that guy's doing. But here, let me do a more. Let me do a catch. Just like a tap error, error, bug, error. And so you see we got error fail here. So if you, my advice would generally be if you have a process, like generally I think most of the time you don't actually want to create these fibers that you're forking that you're never joining. And most ZIO operators won't do that if you think about things that are like running a bunch of things in parallel. So I'd say this would be like a little bit like unusual. Basically, you want to create some type of background process. And a lot of times I would either join it back when I want the background process to be done, or if you really are creating this background process, it can be good to just create a little error handler like this, so that you know if kind of something happens with the background process, then that gets written somewhere. Okay. Any other questions on that or anything else? I think that has probably taken us to a pretty good time, so we can come back to the actors another session. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I skipped one of Adrian's questions. In those nasty cases where we go between ZIO and legacy CATS code or HTTP4S to ZIO services, are there any tricks or good to knows to have? So I think you're probably doing this, but if you're not already, there's a ZIO interop CATS library. So kind of going back and forth between legacy code and ZIO. And I would actually generalize this a little bit of there are ZIO interop libraries for most quote unquote legacy things you have to work with. And you know, I don't want to use like legacy in a pejorative way, but just other things, I guess. But if you're working with reactive streams and the reactive stream protocol, Simon's done a lot of good work on. There's a ZIO interop reactive streams that will kind of turn the various publishers or consumers in that world into the corresponding ZIO data types. If you're working with CATS code, there's a ZIO interop CATS that has a lot of nice methods that usually there's kind of a one line like .to XYZ or .from ABC that will turn a ZIO thing into a CATS effect thing or a CATS effect thing into a ZIO thing. So I would definitely check that out. But also, I think that's there if you need it. But I think by far the simplest thing is if you can kind of stay out of that and just live in one world. So if you're already in the situation where you got a bunch of code and something else, then it's great to interrupt there. But if you can and you got kind of the option, I would say using kind of ZIO native libraries is just going to make things easier for you. But I don't know if I have any particular things beyond that are super general there. Okay. Well, cool. Well, hopefully this was helpful for everyone. This was a little bit of a grab bag. I know sometimes people can be quiet, but I'd really encourage everyone, if there's stuff you want to see, paste it in the Discord after this as well, and I'll kind of take that and kind of use that for future sessions as well. And I think that'll be particularly good because I mean these were all great because they were kind of things that I could answer off the cuff, but you may have some things where it's like, well, how do I do this particular thing with ZIO schema? Maybe like, I need to look at ZIO schema and see exactly how we do this thing. So if you do have stuff that requires a more like that, like if you want to share that, then I can look into some of that stuff and we can talk about that another time. But hope everyone's doing well and hope everyone has a good weekend here. Thanks so much for joining.